What's up, and welcome to Clarity for Parents of Athletes, bringing you stories from professional athletes about their parents and how they were raised. My name is Gabe from aclearmind.com. All right, and welcome to episode number 28 of Clarity for Parents of Athletes. I hope you're enjoying all the episodes so far and the interviews that I've done with the athletes. This one is actually with a parent, the first time I've interviewed a parent of an athlete. So I'm really excited to let you guys listen to that. But first, I just wanted to take some time and thank you for listening and ask that you, if you haven't already, to subscribe to the podcast so that you hear all these interviews with the athletes, and as like I said, with this episode with the parents. And I also ask that you please rate, review the podcast on Apple Podcast and share it with others to help them make their parenting even better than it already is. And of course, it's all for the benefit of their children, which is the whole point of doing what I'm doing. So this episode is the first one that I've interviewed a parent of an athlete, and the guest is Sue Hansen, who is the mother of former Chicago Bulls center Luc Longley, who played for the Bulls in the 1990s. Before he did that, Luc played college basketball at the University of New Mexico before the Minnesota Timberwolves picked him 7th overall in the 1991 NBA draft. Now, after almost 3 years in Minnesota, they traded him to Chicago, where Luc won 3 NBA titles and played for legendary coach Phil Jackson, one of my favorite coaches in any sport, and with legendary players like Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Tony Kukoc, Dennis Rodman, and of course, Steve Kerr, who is the current head coach of Golden State Warriors in the NBA. His mother, Sue, and father Richard were basketball players themselves, and Sue and my mom knew each other when she was getting her PhD at the University of New Mexico, and my mom was a professor at the University of New Mexico. And after some persistence on my part and a little bit of cyber stalking, I was able to track her down with the help of one of her other sons, Sam Longley. Now, typically in the interviews that I do, we hear the athlete's perspective on their journey, but obviously in this one, it's going to be a little bit different. We'll hear a parent's perspective on raising a high-level athlete, and Sue will tell us some stories from Luc's journey and how she and Richard, Luc's dad, supported him through the bumps in the road, which every athlete has, and advice for parents raising athletes today. She also talks about a major experience, or at least I think it's a major experience, that Luc had during his youth days that I feel helped mold him into a future professional basketball player. Now, please stay tuned to the end of the episode where I dive in a little bit deeper with my takeaways and point out some things that I know will be very, very beneficial to all the parents listening and to players, of course. All right, enjoy. So, Sue, thanks so much for your time today. I appreciate it. How's everything going for you?
Good, thanks, Gabe. And it's a pleasure to be talking to you.
Well, good. The pleasure is all mine, I'm sure. So I do have to tell you, I recently learned the term synchrodestiny, which is basically when you start to see something, or you think of something, and then the universe starts to basically give you more and more and show little signs of that. So just Sunday, I found out from my wife that a friend of ours who we met when we went to Bali last summer, who is from Perth, was randomly in town in Albuquerque. And then today I woke up and I had a video message from a friend of mine who actually, it was his wedding in Bali who we went to, but I woke up and I saw this message from him that he was on the beach in Perth and just saying what a beautiful time he was having. And now I'm talking to you, somebody from Perth area as well. So I think it's really, a big sign of synchrodestiny. So I feel like this is the right time for us to connect.
Good. Well, I would call that synchronicity. I haven't heard synchrodestiny, but I do strongly have a lot of faith in synchronicity.
Yeah, it definitely exists. Yeah, that's a term from Deepak Chopra. I recently did a 21-day abundance manifestation challenge. So, and that was a term that he brought up in there. So I thought it was very synchronistic or synchrodestinistic, if that's even a word. So I definitely, obviously, want to talk to you about what it was like raising Luke and your other sons, but I want to get to know you a little bit in your time back in Perth or wherever you originated from before that. So I'd like to know your history a bit, and especially your athletic journey for yourself before we get into your sons. So I'll let you take it away.
Right. Well, I grew up in Melbourne. I was born in Melbourne, which is on the east coast, and Perth is on the west. And I grew very tall very quickly, but I was also just loved every sport pretty much that I could play. And I was a high jumper, and I played what we called women's rules basketball, but was, I think, called netball here, maybe, I'm not sure. But when I was about to go to university, I thought, well, it's about time I met some tall men. So I better play basketball. I better learn to play basketball. And rolled up to the recruiting desk during orientation week, and the girls at the recruiting desk practically fell off their chairs because I think I was certainly 6'3", maybe even my full 6'4" at that point. So they were overjoyed. Of course, they didn't realize immediately they were getting a complete neophyte. And we started playing, and we were playing at a very low level. And I looked around, and it was just impossible. I've just got to play basketball. I'm enjoying it. And then 2 years later, I met Richard Longley, later, of course, Luke's dad. And he was a basketball player from Perth. So we got together, and we had Luke, the first of our three boys. And when Luke was about 10 months old, he got a job offer in Perth, and we moved back to Perth. So all the boys, Luke was born in Melbourne, but the other two, Sam and Griff, were born in Perth. And Luke basically doesn't remember anything of Melbourne anyway. So they're all Perth boys now.
Mm. So were you continuing playing basketball when you were in Perth, when you moved back?
Not at first, no. I think pregnancy stopped me. We started at a low level, but we rocketed up. We were pretty darn good. And my 6'4" didn't hurt that at all. And I was training with the state squad when I found out that I was pregnant. So I just stopped. But then, then we get into Luke's. Yeah, that leads me naturally into Luke's athletic history, because when he wanted to start playing a team sport, he went to rugby. And Richard and I kind of looked at each other and rolled our eyes, but he wanted to do that. So we let him play, and he was the second best player on the team. The best was a little nuggety kid who was really excellent and built for rugby. And Luke was like this gazelle who was running beside him, almost as fast and almost as talented, but a good foot taller, with great long, skinny legs that looked hugely at risk, in the scrums and things. So it made us very nervous, and we didn't we hoped he wouldn't continue playing rugby, but we didn't put any pressure on him at all. And then he decided of his own accord when he was, I can't remember exactly, but I think he was 10, 11 or 12, somewhere around there, that he'd had enough of rugby, and he wanted to play basketball. So we were overjoyed. And personally, wow. I think basketball was in his blood, because I'd watched, he'd heard bouncing balls probably in utero, when I was watching Richard play. I think I mentioned Richard was a basketballer. Yeah, so, and then he would, of course, hang out as a toddler at his dad's basketball games. And, I have a vision of him in a little uniform that I'd made for him in some black jersey that I had with a West Australian, with black and gold, with a big black number 13 on the back, gold number 13 on the back, which was Richard's number. And later on was always Luke's number too.
Oh, wow.
And here's this little kid still in his diaper, running out onto the court, trying to throw the ball up and barely getting it higher than his head, and all the big kids kind of deferring to this little one because, he was so tiny. So that was probably his very first basketball experience.
Wow. It's hard to imagine Luke ever being tiny, but I'm sure obviously it did happen.
He was not tiny compared to his age mates, believe me. He was always a big boy.
Wow. So, I want to go back to this beginning of rugby. What made Luke want to do rugby at the time? And how old was he when he started?
I can't quite remember. I think he was about 7 or 8, I think. And I think he must have had some friend at school who was playing and he wanted to play too, something like that.
Wow.
I don't remember well. But he was clearly, he was a kid who ran and climbed and threw balls, loved balls. He was an active kid.
Mm-hmm.
And sport was just calling to him. And that just happened to be his first encounter.
Wow. So I know, there's so many studies now on head injuries and American football here, and I imagine rugby as well. They're starting to get this stigma of fear for parents to let their children play.
About time, I would say.
Yeah. Do you think you would have, with all this research that's going on about head injuries and concussions and CTE, do you think if Luke was today 7 years old wanting to play rugby, do you think you would have approached it the same and letting him, or do you think you would have?
That's a really good question, Gabe. Terribly difficult to answer. At a kid level, it's a bit different. I don't know. I like to think I would have said no, but I really, as a parent, I really liked to let the boys do what it was they were interested in.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than force my opinions on them.
Yeah.
Because, of course, we wanted them to play basketball. That was the family sport.
Right. So did you you and Richard try and convince him to play basketball, or did you just let it happen naturally?
Absolutely. Never tried to convince him.
Yeah, I wonder if you guys would have put more pressure on him, if that would have deterred him from wanting to play.
It may have, yeah. We did, in a way, we put pressure on the other two. Luke led the way, and we just kind of signed them all up. I'm not sure how much choice we gave them at all. And the other two were a lot littler and never showed quite the presence on court. The basketball intelligence that Luke showed. Luke showed that right from his first game. It was truly interesting to watch.
Huh. He just had that natural feel for it.
Yeah, he was playing with boys that had been playing together since they were about 6 or 7 or something. There was a very good. I should say that the Australian system is very different to here. There's a club system, so that any age, pretty much one's entire life, you can play club sport in your sport of choice. Mm-hmm. And most of the local clubs had a venue that, they had these big stadiums. All my grandchildren have been through a stadium in a place called Coburn, which is pretty run down looking, but it has hundreds and hundreds of kids learning to play basketball in it.
Awesome.
It's really a lovely thing, and all their parents and sometimes grandparents. I quite often go because I love to see them playing. But it was a little less developed when Luke started, but not much. I think he was actually playing at the Coburn Stadium. But the kids that he was playing with had started really young because that was there for them. Mm-hmm. And so at any age, you could just slip into the club system. The school teams were not at all important, very minimal, and nor were the university teams. So we didn't have the university team structure that you have here. Mm-hmm. But the good thing was that everybody could play, and people who weren't as good didn't get shunted out because they weren't good enough to make the team.
Right.
They just went to a different level.
It's more inclusive.
Much more. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, the idea that everyone should be this level, I think, is really harmful for other children, because essentially it's about being active and making friends and learning to be healthy,
And learning to work with people.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So were you and Richard still playing basketball when Sam and Griff?
Richard was.
Okay. When Sam and Griff when they started to play basketball?
Yes. Yes. Richard, only Richard. I was, I just had too much to do. Mm-hmm. But it did get to me, the bouncing of the balls. that sound, which I just love. Uh-huh. It got to me, and I can't remember how old the boys were. I could work it out, but they'd been playing for a couple of years, and I said, I've got to play again. So we managed to somehow squeeze in 4. Sam and Griff were in the same, they were 16 months apart. They were in the same team. Mm. And then Luke was in a different team. And Richard, of course, was playing at the top level, and I was playing at a sort of a mid-women's level. Mm. So that was pretty hectic. There was a lot of basketball in our life for quite a while.
Yeah. Did you guys have a hoop at the house?
I don't think we did.
So there's no basketball in the house. You guys would have to go out and play.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So how did it develop as far as level of competition that each of the boys were playing during their childhood as they grew up?
Well, it was very simple for Luke. He was I didn't really talk fully about his very first game. I watched him playing with boys who've been playing together for ages. That's where I kind of got sidetracked. And yet the ball kept going. The loose ball kept going to Luke's hand. And he was the one getting the rebound under the basket and putting it back up and getting it in. That was his first game. It was really eye-opening to watch. I said, this kid's clearly got basketball in his blood. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, and I should tell you, when Richard and I were engaged in Melbourne, the local paper got wind of it and took a photo. Unfortunately, Richard was 6'10". They took the photo from down low, so that like from our feet, so that these 2 enormous beings sort of going on forever up into the sky. And the headline was something like, the future of Australian basketball.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Which was prophetic. And I remember it well, but I have not been able to find that photograph or that article.
Wow.
Sort of way pre-digital. It would have been 1968, I guess.
Wow. Maybe it's on microfiche somewhere in some vault somewhere in Australia.
I've tried a couple of times and I haven't got anywhere.
Wow.
I don't even remember what paper it was in. It was in maybe a paper that's now defunct.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Yeah.
But it was pretty prophetic, really, because Luke was the first Australian, not the first Australian to play college basketball, but the first to make it to the NBA, the first to make it to the draft, the first to make it to the NBA, and certainly the first to win a championship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was a pioneer.
Yes, he was.
Yeah. So before we jump into the NBA, let's keep going with his high school season or his high school career, and then on to when he was recruited into college. What was that like for him and for you guys?
Do you want more about his childhood sport before we get to that, or do you want to go straight?
Sure, yeah. If there's something else more about a childhood sport, let's go for it.
Yeah, I think there is. There's a couple of things. He was part of this. He was then part of that cohort that had been together and were looking pretty promising in the local organization. And he was chosen for, I believe it was the under-14 state team. I think that would be the first. I think that was the first time that he was at the state team level, and he was probably 12 at the time, and he was just so cocky about it. And as a result, he was fooling around a lot and not serious about the trainings. And the coach gave him a warning, and he took no notice. And the coach dropped him.
Wow.
And it was just hugely hard for Luc to be dropped. But it was an enormous learning lesson. And probably, I think, in the scheme of things, maybe quite an important learning lesson.
Wow.
That coach, became infamous later
Mm-hmm.
as the one who dropped Luc Longley from a state team. But at that time, it was we were very supportive of the coach, and we were sad for Luc, but we felt that he'd done the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, how did you communicate with Luc during that time, at that moment?
Oh, I think we sat him down and talked to him about it, and that if you don't do your best, and if you don't heed the person who's trying to coach you, then he really has not much choice. And that he'd be able to do it again, but this one was a learning lesson.
Wow. That's amazing, because I've experienced with myself as a coach that if I dropped somebody, I had the parent coming up to me and defending the child.
Oh, I know.
And then
I know. I find that so incomprehensible.
Yeah.
It's the way a lot of parents do it these days, and I don't like it at all.
Right.
I think you've got to let the child learn his lessons, her lessons.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if that coach... Go ahead, sorry.
Well, I was going to say, it really depends on what the whole point of playing sport is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if playing sport is to win every time and to be the best and to have a career out of it, then you're on the wrong track, because most people aren't going to get there. We never, ever expected that for Luc, but if we had, it wouldn't have made any difference. It was, something like that has to develop. And the child's got a long way to go from his childhood teens before he's going to be any kind of a success at the sport. So I think the whole idea of sport seems to me to have shifted for many people, and it's all about being successful and winning and possibly making money out of it, rather than something that teaches you teamwork, it teaches you hard work, it teaches you application, it teaches you thoughtfulness. What else is there?
Accountability as well.
Accountability, absolutely. And the one that they're talking about now is one of the main things that you need to teach your child. It's gone right out of my mind. Persistence, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right? Is that the word? Something like that. The ability to keep going, to take a knock
Perseverance.
and to keep going. Perseverance, that's it. Great. Thanks, Gabe.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think those things are such life lessons and so much more valuable than the immediate success. That it really worries me when I hear parents talking about sport as as about winning. Winning is nice, but it's just one of the things that comes along with it.
Right. Yeah, if that coach who cut Luc, if he would have been more focused about winning and said, all right, I'm going to bring this guy who I imagine was probably the more talented player on the team and physically dominant, if he would have said, all right, I'm going to bring him no matter what because he's going to help me win, that probably could have changed the path for Luc's journey for his entire life.
Possibly. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how did Luc respond after being cut like that?
Well, he was a fairly buoyant kid, and he was disappointed, very disappointed, but he got over it pretty quickly.
And did that change the way he approached training?
I think it did. He never had that charge against him again.
Wow.
In fact, I think he really that and other things taught him to learn to work really hard at it.
Mm-hmm. What else taught him to learn really hard and get him to where he ended up?
Well, possibly not all that much until much later.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think playing at a college level, I don't know, there's a part of he had a year when he was 17 at the Australian Institute of Sport. And I don't quite know, I mean, we talked a lot, but we didn't really talk much about his playing. I don't quite know what he learned from that. That was, but I know that when he started playing in Albuquerque, he was training a lot. And there was he's a very relaxed kind of person, Luke. Like, loves to joke, loves to play jokes, kind of just always seems like he's taking life very easy. Mm. But I know that he was in the gym and training really a lot. And there were certain sports writers at the time who gave him a really hard time because they just saw the joking Luke.
Uh-huh.
They didn't see they talked to him and he would joke about it, you know. And I remember one sports writer who wrote about Luke had been home for summer for summer in Australia, which of course it wasn't, it was winter, and how he just spent the summer surfing. In fact, he'd been working out really hard back in Australia and had thought that the reporter was pretty funny, thinking he was going back to summer. Mm. So he played along with the summer idea. And this idiot wrote a very scathing thing about what a flake he was. Mm. Couldn't even keep up his basketball over summer. I remember that one well.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what was his high school? Do you have any stories about his high school career before we jump into the recruiting?
Yeah. I have one great one. Because, you know, he was playing basketball, but he could do anything else that he wanted to do as well. And he went to a boys' school a private boys' school that was part of an organization of boys' schools across the country. And so they would have, actually just in the state, they would have a big sports thing with all of the schools competing against each other. And I remember we went along and Luke was competing in, of all things, the shot put.
Oh, wow.
And he was dressed in his school gym costume and he had regular school gym shoes on. And all these other kids were in their sort of fancy athletic silks, you know, and they had the special shoes and they were practicing their very careful run-up and doing their breathing exercises and, you know, very, very serious about it. And Luke, who stood ahead above everybody else and had this lovely, open, smiling face, he had the shot put in his hand and he was kind of tossing it around a bit. And he was wandering around with a grin on his face, talking to people. And Richard and I are sitting in the stands thinking, oh, my God, you know, what have we done? What's up with this kid? He's not serious about this at all. He was in the second division because he'd won his school's shot put, but the father of the boy who came second was very angry that Luke was not a serious shot putter and his son was. And so I can't remember how it worked, but he got his son promoted to the first division and Luke put in the second, right?
Jeez.
So Luke strolls up to the circle where you do the shot put. And it doesn't do his run-up at all, just kind of stands there and hefts the ball. And it is a record, not just for his school, but for the entire boys' college thing.
Wow.
by quite a way. And, of course, the father and the boy who were in the first division, they were probably furious, but I thought they had to feel a bit silly about that.
Yeah, of course.
So, I mean, I guess really that's just about Luke's personality and his sporting ability. He's very fortunate to be a very gifted athlete. Mm-hmm. Although not one with a whole lot of jump, as anybody will tell you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, when you're 7'2", sometimes you don't need to jump that high to reach things
Yeah.
like the basketball or the basket.
Yeah.
So how did he end up at the University of New Mexico and in Albuquerque?
Oh, well, he would never have, except that his good friend Andy Vlahoff, who he played basketball with in Perth, who was an amazing athlete. He was 6'7" and would be the first back on the sprints, the basketball sprints. You know, he was very fast, very strong, very tall, and very fast. His dad came to the US for a year to work and brought his family with him. And Andy attracted all kinds of attention. And as far as I know, I don't have any actual facts on this, but I think probably the coaches that came to Perth to see Andy were some of the first visiting coaches. It's certainly in Perth, definitely in Perth, but maybe who knows where else. So Andy was a good friend, and he said, well, you know, I could bring my friend along who'll pass the ball for me. So all the coaches said yes, and Luke turns up and, you know, several inches higher than Andy and great passing skills. And but two coaches just dropped their interest in Andy, who ended up going to Stanford and for basketball and being academic All-American. Unlike Luke, who did not finish his degree. But New Mexico and Hawaii got very interested in Luke and recruited him heavily. And the New Mexico coach was very, very charming. I found him too charming. I found him not a person I could trust very well. And he was telling us all these amazing things about what Luke could do and be. And to us, that meant nothing. You know, we really didn't have much of an interest or knowledge of the NBA, and never occurred to us before. But it was very interesting to Luke. Actually, Richard, his dad, was pretty interested. I think he would have liked it for himself. And, Anyway, Gary Colson, the coach, took Luke off the next day to New Mexico with him, which I felt at the time, we didn't know, but I didn't feel it was kind of quite kosher. It didn't seem right. And I don't think it was. I think it was a bit of a violation of recruiting rules. But anyway, Luke was he went to Hawaii too, but Hawaii couldn't really hold a candle to New Mexico. And Gary was, you know, he was tuned into a young boy's wavelengths, and all I could see is that he wanted to take my 18-year-old son to the other side of the world, and with all these grandiose promises. So, yeah.
How are you able to? Sorry, go ahead.
Go on.
No, you go ahead.
Luke was absolutely sold. He came back and he said, "Oh, Mum, the coach says that I can have lots of beautiful women and lots of wonderfully big cars and a big house."
Wow.
I said, "Great." Anyway. Yeah.
So he knew how to work an 18-year-old.
He did.
Yeah.
He did.
Yeah. But you seem much more grounded than that. How did you guide Luke during that time?
I didn't feel I could. Well, actually, I did express some resistance to Gary when he came back. Totally convinced, totally sure that he had him, you know. And yet here's a mother who's not really buying it all. And he came back by saying, "Well, I think you should come and visit and see for yourself." And that was my first visit to the US, and I had no real interest in going to the US. Ironic that I've been here now for 30-something years. So I did. I took the trip, and I went to Hawaii, and I went to New Mexico, and you know, Gary was he let me see the best of it, and and I couldn't really disagree. And one of the interesting things was I met a man on the plane, just sitting next to him, who was a huge basketball fan, lived in Albuquerque, the Los Angeles to Albuquerque plane. And when I told him why I was coming, he was so excited, and his wife and family became friends to Luc, and sort of, they were sort of a home situation for him for a few years while he was there.
Oh, wow.
But, New Mexico is a wonderful place, absolutely wonderful. I think the place did its magic on me. I wouldn't have resisted to the point of saying no anyway, because that was what he wanted. But I did feel like I was able to kind of, I don't know, maybe I was just charmed too in the end. I don't know.
Did Luc say...
Anyway, New Mexico was more New Mexico than the coach, believe me.
So you guys fell in love with the place. It does have a mystique for sure.
It does.
Yeah.
It does.
So he was on his way, and did you come to Albuquerque with him immediately, or did you give him some time?
No, I actually went to Hawaii. And the full circumstances of that I prefer not to talk about.
Okay.
But then I did my master's at the University of Hawaii, and decided to come to New Mexico then after that.
So you were...
Richard and I by that time were long divorced.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how was it with Luc's recruiting? I imagine you and Richard weren't always on the same page. What was that time like for you guys?
We were divorced at that time.
So what was your experience like with that? With you have your opinions about Luc going, and Richard had his opinions. What was your experience like, both between you and Richard, and you and Luc and Richard as well?
It was a pretty hard time, actually. Luc he went through a period, he was 17, 18, almost 19. And he was a bit cocky. And, it was hard. I think that's all I need to say about that.
Okay. Enough said there. Well, you made it through, and you got your master's.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really, I think Luc and I did not have a very good relationship during that period, but we certainly have now. We certainly had when he went to New Mexico, by the time he went to New Mexico. And I was able to visit him at Christmas time because he couldn't go anywhere. He was playing basketball. And I was in Hawaii, and I was poor as a church mouse, but they were offering fares like $200 return fare, Hawaii to Albuquerque, so that people would be flying on the planes that were flying back to pick up more people to come to Hawaii.
Make it worthwhile.
So I spent a couple of Christmases with him, and that was really good.
Oh, great. So you moved here after your master's degree. You moved to Albuquerque after your master's degree. And what was that experience like in your relationship with Luc while you both were here?
It was lovely. It was really lovely. Griff came too. Griff had started in Hawaii with me and then gone back home. And then he came and did his last 2 years of high school at Albuquerque High School. And so we had a little bit of family. It was lovely.
Great. And Sam, your other son, stayed back in Perth with Richard?
Yes. Sam was nearly done with school, and he just wasn't prepared to move. And I think that was hard. That was hard for him, and it was hard for me, but that was how it needed to be. Yeah.
Wow. So Luc had an amazing career here. That's around the time that I moved to Albuquerque. And so I definitely remember, I think I was here for his last year or two of college basketball, and I remember him
Uh-huh.
getting drafted into the NBA. So what was that like for you guys when,
Oh, that was surreal, totally surreal. It was the whole production of it, going to New York, actually being flown first class to New York.
Wow.
And then put up at a fancy hotel along with all the other parents and toured around New York in a bus, sometimes with our boys and sometimes just the parents. It was really another world, one I knew nothing about.
You just fell into it.
Yeah.
So he was drafted by Minnesota. What did you know about Minnesota before Luc got drafted there? And did you have any idea?
Basically nothing.
It was cold.
Sorry. Did I have any idea?
Did you have any idea that that's where he was going to end up, or on the day of the draft?
No. Oh, we had no idea. I don't know. Maybe some people had, projected ideas of how the draft would go, but we had no idea. He went number 7, which was pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's big time.
Yeah.
So he was whisked off to Minnesota. Did you stay here in Albuquerque, or did you go up there with him?
No, I stayed here in Albuquerque. By that time, he had a very serious girlfriend who was later his first wife. And I'm pretty sure, I don't quite remember, but I'm pretty sure she went. Maybe not. Maybe Luc just went up by himself initially.
And what was that first year like for him, and how did you support him emotionally? Because a mom's always supporting her son, or always at least has opinions to give her son, if you're anything like my mom. No,
I try not to give opinions too much. I try to listen. How could I give an opinion about something I knew absolutely nothing about? It's a totally foreign thing. It was a his time in Minnesota was very hard. And I would be trying to watch every game I could, still in Albuquerque, so I would often went to, I can't remember the name of the sports bar that his friend Roger Ressler had, and they would put the TV to the game if Luc was playing, if they could. Sometimes they couldn't, sometimes they couldn't get it. So I'd watch every game I could, and I just saw him getting, he doesn't always hide his emotion well, and he looked just miserable. He was running down the court, and his steps were heavy, and his posture wasn't, I don't know if other people noticed it, but I certainly knew it. So we would talk often, and I can't remember how much he told me about what was going on with the team. It wasn't, it was not a terribly well managed team, and I know that at one they had a private plane, and the son of one of the owners of the team, who was about 12 or something, basically turfed Luc out of a seat one time because he wanted it and he had the right. So the players were low down on the totem pole of importance.
Wow.
So that was how it seemed like it was a family-run thing. It was run for the family, and the players were less important.
Wow.
And we went up a few times, and I managed to get to his very first NBA game, which was in Dallas. Or was that the first? I think it was his very first. And he was up against David Robinson, who was very tough. And afterwards, really cut Luc out of the game. He's a better player and far more experienced. But afterwards on television, I caught the interview, and he was really horrible about it. He really, very unencouraging
Mm.
about Luke. And I thought that was so small of him. You know, such a big and well-known and good player to be so small. So I thought that was pretty nasty.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
Of course, it was my son, so, you know,
Yeah.
made it a bit worse.
Exactly. How did Luke remember that interview at all?
No,
Okay.
he didn't. He wouldn't have heard the interview, I'm sure.
Yeah. Wow. So he spent, I think, about 3 years in Minnesota, right? 2 or 3 years?
Maybe 2.5.
Mm.
I can't quite remember. Then was traded, and well, actually, what's really interesting is that about a month before he was traded, I was looking for jobs, and I'd finished my doctorate, and I was looking for jobs, and I had an interview in Chicago, and it went well, and I called Luke up, and I said, "Look, I'm really thinking I might take this job. It's not that far from Minnesota," and he said, "Mum, don't take a job for me. I'm pretty sure I'm going to be traded."
Wow.
I said, "Well, okay, but this is a good job. I think I'm going to take it," which I did. And a month later, he called up and he said, "You're not going to believe this." Said, "Guess where I've been traded?" "I don't know, darling." "I'm going to Chicago."
Wow.
And so I think about this and I say to him, "Oh, is that a good move?"
Yeah.
So that was my absolute ignorance of NBA basketball. And he said, very patiently, he said, "Yes, Mum. Best coach in the league, Michael Jordan. It's a good move." Actually, maybe Michael was out at that point. But anyway, he was very happy to be playing with Phil Jackson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. So you had no idea about how their organization was, who was there, anything. You were
nothing.
Nice, beautiful.
No,
just Mom.
no interest. And he moved the next day, or like immediately.
Uh-huh.
And I had accepted my job, but I didn't move until July.
Oh wow.
So yeah.
No, synchrodestiny, I think. Right? They both ended up there.
So. Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah, and he was Kelly was pregnant, so they were expecting their first baby.
Oh, perfect.
Was born in Perth in the off season, and came back to Chicago, and I was here to greet her at 3 weeks old. So that was a wonderful thing.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah. Good for you.
Yeah.
Wow.
Very lovely.
It's great.
That's definitely synchronicity or synchrodestiny. Definitely.
Exactly. Wow. So he was traded, and then Michael Jordan came back, and they went on just a 3-year amazing run to win back-to-back-to-back. What was your experience like? And I imagine you went to quite a few games as well.
I went to as many as I could. My job required me to, I was teaching groups of teachers who were already teaching, so the classes were in the evening, and so it required a lot of evening work. So I went to probably about 50% of the games. Absolutely loved it. Because I'm not a great sports fan, but if my children are playing, I really love it. I will watch endlessly.
Wow. Of course. I can imagine. Wow. Yeah, I mean, I could just picture, without having that experience myself, but when the announcer, and I remember watching the openings to the Bulls games and the announcer calling out the players and how intense it was. I could imagine when they called Luc Longley, the feeling that you must have had when you're at those games.
Absolutely. Wow. Wonderful. Yeah.
Beautiful.
But then, of course, I would live and die on how he played. I mean, so if he'd miss a shot or muff a pass or, I would just die. And then and when he played well, I would just expand.
Oh.
Yeah.
So when you were sitting in the stands and Luke would miss a pass or make a mistake, I'm sure you could hear groans in the crowd.
Yes. Yes.
What was
And,
that like for you?
Oh, horrible,
Yeah.
horrible. But, you just have to, there was a lot of that. I had to learn pretty quickly to not let it really upset me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you ever say anything to anybody?
Did I or he?
Yeah. Did you ever say anything to anyone in the crowd?
Oh, I did at college level. I really got into it one time with somebody and they'd hung an effigy of Luke over the court, strung out by the neck. It was Las Cruces,
New Mexico State.
New Mexico State, and somebody behind me was really, or maybe he was in front of me, because when he was walking out, he was at a lower level. He had a big cowboy hat on, and I tipped it off his head. Not one of my finer moments. I had to do something to sort of unbottle the aggression.
Right.
I'm not usually aggressive, but those situations, they're huge. I mean, as you know, as every sports fan knows, they're so huge for adrenaline.
Right.
Even if you're not playing. And as a parent of a player, the adrenaline's pretty intense.
Yeah, I could imagine. Wow. So going back to Chicago, Luke is pretty mild-mannered from what I've seen and what you've said. And he was playing with one of the most intense basketball athletes ever to play. And I saw video of Michael getting into Luke's face a couple times.
Yes.
Did Luke ever talk to you about those experiences?
Not then. No. I think he was busy processing them himself. Luke is very smart emotionally. And I think he's had to be, and he's learned a lot about how to manage himself, and he manages himself very well. So it was only afterwards that he really told me that it was pretty nasty. But he also told me, he probably told me by the time that Michael had turned around and had begun to totally realize what Luke brought to the team, and was very, very, finished up very complimentary of Luke. So Luke was a very different center, as you would remember. He was not a high-scoring center. He was more of a thinking and a passing center. And Michael was sort of looking for, another Shaquille O'Neal, which Luke never was. But Phil knew that, and Phil chose Luke very consciously for the skills that he did have, his teamwork, his ability to pass, his ability to read the court, that kind of thing. And Michael came to see it. And they are now, which is really interesting, they are now quite good friends and are in constant communication. Well, regular, I should say regular communication, not constant.
Right. Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
So, speaking of Phil, he's one of my favorite coaches, and, I approach my coaching, my soccer coaching, in a very deep and spiritual and connected way. And I know Phil did the same with basketball, where he had the players meditating and, approach it from a Zen mentality. Was Luke ever exposed to something like that in his childhood before he met Phil?
Somewhat, because that's very definitely a part of me. I've been a meditator for a long time. Richard and the boys never were, but I've also done a lot of yoga, and we did yoga as a family for quite a while when Luke was growing up. So he's definitely very open to that, very open to that.
That's great. So I imagine when Phil introduced it, he was probably more responsive than some of the other players were.
He would have no barriers to it. In fact, he would be happy. I remember him telling me that they were doing yoga or they were doing meditation or something. He always seemed to really like it. Whereas I'm sure to some of the others it was, what the hell is this? But not for Luke.
Yeah, I think I remember reading or hearing an interview with Michael saying that when he started meditating, when Phil made the meditate, he would open his eyes to see if anybody else was actually doing it, because he was a little resistant, but he finally caved into it. And I know meditation really helps with emotional intelligence and being calm and centered and grounded. So, this aspect that you said that Luke had, that he was very intelligent emotionally, had to have come from your influence, I believe. Do you remember raising Luke and the boys with any intention on values that you wanted to give them, such as kind of calmness and emotional intelligence, or did it just happen?
No, I think it just happened. I think I'm a listener. I like to listen. I like to see what people have got to say, and especially in terms of my children, and work with that. So, I think Luke has surpassed all of us in terms of emotional intelligence. He's very strong on it.
Huh. Wow.
So some of it's just his natural bent, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sure you had your influence on him as well, as parents often do. So what are...
I suppose, it's hard to say that, isn't it? It's part of the air he breathes, but his father wasn't at all interested in any of that. His father's a much more pragmatic person. Doesn't put much value in, or didn't. I don't know him well these days. Didn't put much value in things that weren't black and white and immediately apparent.
Mm.
But very, very strong, I think, on values, Richard. Very, very principled.
What were some values that he wanted to instill in the boys?
Never had to put that in words. So, certainly a work ethic. And also, Richard was a great one for a play ethic too. Having fun and doing what you wanted to do, doing what you liked. We both really stress that. Yeah. So as a result, I have one retired professional basketballer, one still working as an actor, and one trained as a journalist, and now running a not-for-profit to get kids out and playing and away from their cell phones and things.
Awesome.
So they've gone in three very different directions, and they've found each of them a path that has been good for them. Luke is really, in some ways, basketball was not the path of his soul. It was a path of his body that just kind of opened out in front of him. He had the athletic skills, and he had the body, and he had the intelligence, a good basketball intelligence. But I'm not sure. He wanted to be an architect like his dad, and I think he would have been a magnificent architect. It's the skills of architecture are in so much that he seems to really enjoy these days.
So, sometimes the path of our soul can be something like leadership and guidance and mentoring, but the way that we come about it is through sports.
Good point, Gabe. Yeah.
Oh.
Well, Luke is now consulting with an Australian professional team, professional basketball team, and getting a lot of pleasure out of that, working with management, coaching, and players. And that seems to be a very good fit for him.
Yeah, he's a leader.
Yes,
yeah.
A quiet, not a loud or pushy leader, but a quiet leader. Yes, I think he is.
That's awesome. So, kind of going back up to the Bulls and his time there, I've wanted to ask you kind of your opinion on something. I finished watching the documentary on Dennis Rodman recently.
Oh.
And I don't know if you got a chance to see it, but it's very
No.
intense. Yeah, it's very intense. And they talk about his upbringing, and, he didn't have his dad in his life, and he and his mom, there was conflict there. So, in the work that I do with anybody that I work with, whether it's athletes or non-athletes or parents or teams, I always try and focus on doing everything as much as possible from a place of unconditional love. And this, to me, was somebody who didn't receive a lot of unconditional love or didn't feel a lot of unconditional love as a child, which led to kind of these emotional outbursts that he had. Now, as a mother watching this, sometimes there's instinct, I imagine, to feel like this person just needed love and guidance in your life. What was your experience like watching kind of him, and what was Luke's role in trying to help Dennis as well?
Well, I've have had very little to do with Dennis. I always found him extremely interesting, and Luke did too. Luke didn't have, I guess he didn't judge in the way that he's more likely to judge someone for being boring than for being outrageous. He was very interested in him and liked him and did quite a few things with him, but I think Dennis wore him out. He got to a point where his tolerance, when it was affecting the team, he lost his tolerance. Yeah.
Yeah, I could see that. Everybody has that point. They want to help, but then when the other person's not open to receiving that help and assistance, then obviously, there's only so much we can do to help somebody.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's interesting what you said about unconditional love, because I've been a teacher my whole life, high school teacher, and then once I finished my studies, teaching teachers. And that, to me, is the key to teaching.
Mm-hmm.
So coaching, teaching, whatever. It's an unconditional love sees whatever's best and builds on that. And I think, and certainly as a parent, that would have definitely been. That's why I find it really hard to understand the mind of many modern parents who are so intent on building their children.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a listening role. It's not an unconditional role. It's the kids sort of doing something for them, really, for the parent.
Exactly.
I do think that is potentially dangerous for the parent, and certainly for the child. Absolutely for the child. But at some point, the child's going to probably break away and leave the parent feeling very devastated.
Mm-hmm.
That's my sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's often what happens. We start to see things. We can only see things through our eyes, so parents, and especially the way that society is moving these days with the focus on everything that can make them happy is outside of them. Money, cars, houses, fame, athletic performance, all that. We're trained to believe we need to be like that in order to make us happy. But those are all outside influences. Really, the happiness only can come from within us and from our thinking. And when we approach those things from love, it's that love is internal. It doesn't define who we are, essentially. Because we have this other side of us, the ego and the shadow side, that is craving for something outside of us to make us feel complete. But when we focus on that ego side and we don't get those things, we go into a place of devastation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've remembered it wasn't perseverance, although perseverance is terribly important. I remember the other thing that psychologists now are saying is the most important thing that you can give your child, and that's the ability to withhold getting the reward. So that it's really unhealthy to always expect something to come back at you for you immediately. That the more kids can withhold getting the reward, the healthier they will be, and the more perseverance and more success they'll have in their lives.
Because it keeps them focused on the journey and the path, and not the outcome. Yeah. So I know you've talked about it a little bit, but I want to give you a little bit more a chance to give some advice to parents who are raising athletes today. What are a couple things that you would say to them?
That's the hard bit. Well, I really think that your child, it's a dance, I think, between listening to your child and trying to make sure that your child is not just doing the easy thing that is comfortable for him in that moment. So, yes, the child should be staying in with the team for even if they don't really enjoy it for a bit, at least for a while. But if it's really hurting them, then they've got to get out. You need to listen to them and get them out. So it's kind of a balance between doing what the child wants and doing what you think is best for the child's later development. And it's all love-based, has to be love-based, with the child as the center rather than one's own self-love as the center.
It's beautiful. Yeah, as long as we come from a place of love and not fear, which I call it, fear is the fuel of the ego. As long as we're coming from love, then we're making the right decisions. But we have to tune in to if we really are approaching from love, or if we're approaching from any kind of fear that we're not going to have control, or our child's not going to have security in their lives or acceptance in their lives.
Oh, now that reminds me, one more thing. I've just read a wonderful book by David Epstein called Range. And he looks at, he starts out with two sports people, Roger Federer and Tiger Woods. And Tiger Woods was winning putting competitions when he was 2 or something like that, something absolutely bizarrely early. And Roger Federer, I can't remember the exact year, but he didn't specialize. He played all kinds of sports and was totally unpressured to play anything at all. Didn't focus on tennis until he was 15 or 16 or something like that. And David Epstein goes on to show that having a range of experience statistically is much the best way of going, of not being channeled and forgetting the Malcolm Gladwell, I think it was, idea that 10,000 hours is essential to be successful. What's really successful? You need a wide-ranging background in anything, whatever your interests are, and you need to choose and focus. Because when you choose, you'll focus, and the abilities will come very quickly. So that's a fascinating book. Yeah, that's so true. Yep, they need different experiences in life, and not specializing really helps the body physically in the long run as well. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome. Beautiful stuff. Well, Sue, I appreciate your time today. You've had some amazing words and a lot of words of wisdom, and I appreciate you taking us back in your history with yourself and with Luke and your family and your boys. And I wish you all the best. And whenever you go to Perth, say hi to the beach for me, and hopefully I'll be there someday.
It is beautiful. I can't wait.
So what were your biggest takeaways? Now, as usual, there's so many great points as with all my interviews, so I'll have to narrow it down to one or maybe two that impacted me the most. The first one is the fact that Luke was cut from his state team during his youth days in Australia. But not only that, Sue and Luke's dad, Richard, supported the coach in his decision. Now, during my days as a coach, I had to sit down with some parents who were unhappy that I either didn't play their child in a game or the child didn't make the team the parent felt that they should be on or didn't make the team at all. Now, as a coach, those conversations aren't typically fun, but can be productive if the parent is willing to listen with open ears and an open heart. And the problem comes when they listen with a defensive ego. Now, why do parents do this? Well, of course, the root reason is the ego, and it gets triggered because the child is upset. And we don't like to see our children upset, of course, but some parents go into defense mode and start to point fingers at the coach, deflecting any responsibility away from their child. Now, some parents may say there's no way that player should be playing over my child, or that player should be on the team and not my child. And I know my mom got very defensive when I didn't accomplish something and it was up to other people to decide if I passed it or not. Even when she didn't really know much about the situation that I was in, she just didn't want me to quote unquote suffer. But what does this teach the child? And there's a strong possibility reacting by blaming a coach or boss shifts responsibility away from the player or the employee. They'll have a difficult time looking inward and asking questions of themselves like, did I work hard enough? Or did I work on the right things? Or can I work harder and be more focused and disciplined? Parents and players, sometimes they'll tell me like, oh, I've been working hard. And in their mind, they have been. But the job of a coach is to explain, I understand you've been working harder, but you can still work even harder than you are right now. So instead of parents and players being able to look inward, they'll instead make statements and judgments like, oh, the coach has it in for me, or the coach only likes these kind of players, or the coach only plays this kind of style, or it's a political decision, or the coach favors these players even though they don't work hard as my child, or all kinds of other elaborate stories, which totally deflects responsibility and a great chance to learn. Now, one bit of advice I can give to parents who are listening is to never assume what a coach is thinking. You might be right when you assume, but there's a greater chance that you aren't seeing the full picture in your child's coach's mind. Now, if you remember back to my first episode, I talk about the 4 pillars of sports. There's technical, which are the skills that a player has, tactical, which are the decision-making parts of the game and the knowledge about the sport, psychological, which can be broken down into many aspects like work ethic, resiliency, competitiveness, and there's several more that I don't want to get into too much right now. And the last pillar is physical, which can also be broken down into many areas like height, weight, body fat composition, strength, speed, quickness, agility, nutrition. And the physical side is really important to coaches. And sometimes coaches will pick a player based on their physical abilities and not pick a player who works hard but is less physically gifted. That's just the way the world of sports works. But it's always as parents that we can help our children see things in a different light. Now, in Luc Longley's case, he was warned by his coach to take training more seriously. But he didn't take his warning very seriously and was cut from the team. Now, in my opinion, the coach did Luc the biggest service to him in his life, and I imagine paved the way for Luc's success in his future. His parents, Sue and Richard, helped Luc even more by not blaming the coach, but by supporting him. Luc's teammate on the Bulls, Michael Jordan, had a very similar story when he didn't make his high school varsity team, and he essentially used it as fuel to increase his work ethic, something that he was known for throughout his basketball and baseball careers and life in general. It's a mentality. How you do one thing is how you do anything. Now, anytime we can look internally at what our responsibility is in a situation, there's a huge opportunity for growth and development, whether it's on the court, on the field, or other avenues of life. I know my family dynamic between my wife and my daughter and myself completely changed for the better once we stopped pointing fingers at each other and turned them around on ourselves. And that's really the only way to grow, whether it's as a parent or a player. Now imagine if Luc's coach decided to focus more on winning and taking Luc as an incredible athlete with size and agility and soft hands and took Luc instead of cut him. Now, as I mentioned earlier, he did Luke a favor, which helped pave his path to the NBA and 3 championships and playing with and befriending someone who many believe to be the best basketball player ever. So next time you feel triggered because your child didn't make a certain team or win a game or start in a game or get a higher grade, think about responding in a way that will help them grow the most. This takes slowing down and not reacting. And as I mentioned before, the recipe I'm finding during my own journey as a parent is validation of my child's feelings and the situation that they're in, as well as encouraging my son or my daughter to ask themselves how they can respond and where do they need to improve. Now, of course, this is all age dependent. My 20-year-old daughter can understand introspection on an adult level, whereas my 6-year-old son understands it in a different level, of course. But validation is understood at any age because it comes from a place of compassion and from someone's heart. Now, this is felt both on a conscious and unconscious level. Ultimately, Luke felt that unconditional love from his family, and here's yet another example of an athlete that made it to the highest level in a sport with that support. Of course, yes, it helps to be 7'2" tall and a great amount of agility and soft hands, but everyone flourishes more in life with unconditional love than one based on conditions like performance and accomplishments and other things that the child feels are dependent on receiving love. Luke's mom, Sue, said she was a listener and didn't give her opinion about something that she knew nothing about. Now, that led her to be able to just love and support her sons, which is all children really need from their parents. Yes, parents do need to teach discipline and boundaries, but doing that from a place of love and not a place of control and not from fear and intimidation helps any child in the long run to live a life with a clear mind and belief in their limitlessness. So what were your biggest takeaways from this interview with Sue? I'd love to hear about them. You can always contact me at gabe@aclearmind.com or join our group that we have on Facebook. It's called Clarity for Parents of Athletes, and just ask to join and join in the conversation. I hope you enjoyed this. As always, much love to you and many blessings.